David, a lot of our listeners will not have followed the issue of religious discrimination very closely. So what developments have we seen this week?
We've basically seen a very crucial government decision on a total tension between two things. One is the idea of passing laws that enshrine religious freedom, the liberty of religious groups, including religious schools. And the other is all about personal freedom, personal liberty, because we're meant to be in a society that protects people from discrimination. And that means protecting people who are gay teachers, for instance, or transgender students, and giving them protection against unfair treatment, even if that's in a religious school. There has been an idea for years now about somehow reconciling those two things in a package of bills. It was tried in 2018. It was tried in 2022. The government has been working on some kind of package for several months, more than a year in fact. It promised some action at the last election. This week, we've finally found out that the government's unwilling to do that unless it can get a bipartisan agreement, and it's very clear that there is no bipartisan goodwill on this. And so we're ending up at a situation toward the end of the week where there is no way forward, in my view, to actually get some kind of compromise in Parliament.
Yeah. Tass, you've been looking into the sort of history of religious discrimination legislation, which, to be clear, we don't actually have in this country, but it's been talked about by different sides of politics for about 7 years now. Can you just fill us in on the background a little bit?
Yes, it started with the marriage equality debate back in 2017 when then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull commissioned a former Liberal MP, Philip Ruddock, to do a review of religious freedom in Australia as a kind of appeasement to people who were upset about the marriage equality debate. Ruddock came back with his review. He said there was no real problem with your ability to practice religion in Australia, but he nonetheless suggested that there could be or should be a Religious Discrimination Act, which would offer similar protections to that which exists in the Sex Discrimination Act and also exists for age and race. And that report also brought up this issue of how religious schools treat LGBTQ students and staff, which, as we said, is set out in this special exemption in the Sex Discrimination Act. So that kind of bundled these two issues together under a broad religious freedom topic.
Umbrella?
Yeah, umbrella, so to speak. So then you had Morrison promise that that was something that his government was going to do. Then Attorney General Christian Porter introduced the first draft bill for that in 2019. It stalled and stalled. The religious schools and children's issue was a consistent sticking point, and it eventually came to a head, I think, in 2022 with a third version of that bill, and ultimately you had 5 moderate Liberals cross the floor because the party couldn't agree on a consensus around how to treat LGBTQ students and staff in religious schools. Morrison's compromise was, well, I'll write a new exemption into the Sex Discrimination Act so that schools can't expel gay students, but that left trans students with a question mark, it left staff with a question mark, and ultimately the moderates in that party decided it wasn't good enough, and Morrison was forced to shelve the legislation, which was how we end up today, looking at the same issue again.
Yeah, and Albanese did promise in the last election campaign that he was going to sort of settle these two conflicting sides. David, we just want to note as well that there is legislation at a state and territory level for religious discrimination sort of on both sides of this conflict. But at the federal level, we currently don't have any legislation, but there is this exemption in Section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act, which currently does allow religious schools to discriminate on the basis of sex and gender identity and sexuality. That's right? And the Liberals in particular, or some Liberals in particular, are very, very averse to having that exemption removed.
That's right. The current exemption gives special treatment to religious schools. And I guess it can be argued to other religious institutions. They get special treatment because they get an exemption from the Sex Discrimination Act. That's something that many, people of faith believe should exist and they want to keep. So if there was to be a government change to that, it would have to come as a package, they would see, of broader changes that also enshrine religious freedom in some way. And that's the difficult thing to reconcile. But that means that the government's got 2 draft bills. One is a new Religious Discrimination Act that is meant to protect people of faith. The other is an amendment to the Sex Discrimination Act, which is meant to deal with Section 38. But we don't know how the government tries to balance all the competing interests here, because neither of those bills has been released. And in fact, they may never be put to Parliament, because the government's position now is, look, let's get a bipartisan deal, then we can proceed with these two bills. So it's difficult to see a scenario other than those bills remaining in limbo for quite some time.
And we, as you say, we haven't even seen what that draft legislation looks like, so we don't know how the government is attempting to reconcile these conflicting sides of the debate. They have said that they will make some laws in this space, though, haven't they? They sort of, I don't know if you want to call it a distraction or a SOP, but they have announced something else this week, right?
Yeah, but I don't see it as a distraction or a SOP. I think that they're serious about doing something on hate speech, because there's been so much hate speech since the Hamas attack on people in Israel in October, right? And the Israeli Defence Force response in Gaza. The hate speech in Australia is real. And as we reported a few weeks ago, this idea of getting at people by doxing them, that is releasing their private information and making that public as a way to, it's menacing behaviour, some people see. That's something the government does want to deal with. Now, I don't accept the idea that you can't address religious freedom and sex discrimination because you've got an argument about hate speech and doxing. But I think it's fair to say that the hate speech debate does go to the question of vilification of people on the basis of their faith. And so it is a live debate. It was meant to be treated as part of this package. The government said, and it was only said maybe 5 weeks ago, we will address hate speech with tougher penalties as part of our Religious Discrimination Act. But now the Religious Discrimination Act is shelved, and they'll do the hate speech changes on their own.
Yeah, so the hate speech and the doxing changes are unlikely to receive any opposition from the coalition. But what has Dutton called a press conference after Albanese sort of announced this back down, because it was an election promise. He said he was going to settle this issue, and he's now saying, actually, I'm backing away from it because we're not getting bipartisanship on it, which is not what he said at the election campaign. So Dutton called a press conference and he really slammed the PM, didn't he? What did he say?
He said that Albanese was looking for a way out, that Albanese was basically ducking the issue, and that Albanese could not be trusted because he wasn't sticking to his election promise here. This isn't the first time that Peter Dutton has tried to turn something into a question of character for Anthony Albanese, but he certainly went full steam ahead with that line of attack. And, when I asked Peter Dutton, well, what do you want to happen? What is your approach to the law? Do you think a religious school should be able to sack a gay teacher? He didn't want to indicate his actual position. So at no point did we get to a debate about what the law should actually be. It was simply a debate about Albanese's character and this question of whether he should actually deliver on an election promise. I think when you look back at that, you can really feel the anger from Peter Dutton, but at the same time, I can't help wondering, why is he so angry at the idea that Labor wants to pass a bill with coalition support?
Well, he's obviously not going to give that support, is he? I mean, Tass, what do we know, from the history, what do we know about the coalition's position on this issue? Because if Dutton was to try to come to some sort of position on it and enunciate it to the press or to the public, he would have a lot of trouble. It's been incredibly divisive within the coalition, and a real war between the moderates and the Conservatives on this. So, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's one of those things that's just continually driven the coalition apart, right? Now, you don't have the same moderate voices that you had in 2022 who really stood up for the LGBTQ kids in this issue, because a lot of them went on to lose their seats. But you do still have that group of people who were there then who were really opposed to any changes to 38. You've got a couple of coalition senators, Jacinta Price, Claire Chandler, who have really made trans issues a big focus of theirs. You can imagine they're not going to be quiet about it. And then the other thing I think for the coalition is another part of the Religious Discrimination Act that Labor wanted to put in, which is this anti-vilification clause, which is something that Muslim and Jewish groups have pushed for. But the free speech focused MPs in the coalition are also quite concerned about that.
That's really worth pointing out because, in fact, Michaelia Cash made this point in her op-ed on Sunday. And that's a live debate as well. It's separate to the treatment of people in schools. But if you are to say that religious freedom is enshrined in such a way that vilifying a religion is bad, is that an anti-blasphemy law? And that's a big concept that a lot of people who are free speech people have a problem with. And we don't know whether the government was going anywhere near toward doing that. But it's another source of doubt.
Right? They wanted to in 2022. I think Labor tried to introduce its own amendment. And I think the language was something like it was not, the threshold was higher than the section in the Race Discrimination Act, but they wanted to make it unlawful to threaten, intimidate, harass or vilify a person based on their religious beliefs. So there's no reason to think that also wouldn't lend itself to a protracted debate, which is also why bipartisan support on even just the religious discrimination element of this legislation would be difficult, because there are vocal people in the coalition who don't want that kind of clause either.
And bipartisan support is so hard because community support is so hard. There are so many conflicting views in the community on all these questions.
Absolutely. David, I mean, we've just talked a little bit about sort of the underlying agendas, and for both parties, it's not something that cuts across, cuts neatly down left and right sort of lines. Like for both parties, it is really complex, and there's people on all sides of the issue, on both sides of politics. But they could, I mean, if Labor really, really wanted to get a solution on this and fulfil their election promise, they could actually cut a deal without the coalition. Let's remember that they are in government and they can get through legislation by negotiating with independents and Greens, right?
Yeah, and I think the challenge is whether they could get something through the Parliament and then suffer a loss of support in the community, even though they might win the vote in Parliament House. And that's a calculation that the government is making about the difficulty put it this way, that's a calculation the government's making about the risk of offending people of faith. Yeah. And they don't want to do that. I think this is interesting in light of the 2019 election, because there's always been a debate about whether Morrison won in part because people of faith backed him and they drifted away from Labor. Labor lost votes in Western Sydney.
Yeah.
There was a concern that some people in those many different multicultural communities preferred Morrison to Labor. Now, I've checked with people on whether the data shows that people of faith turned against Labor in 2019, and I'm told it does not. That's from Ian McAllister at the Australian National University. So I think we've got to be hard-headed here rather than making assumptions about whether Labor would lose people of faith on this issue. However, it's something that's at the back of people's minds, and I think Anthony Albanese is making a decision here that he doesn't want a fight with church leaders and religious school leaders.
Well, and that's really interesting to me, because I know that the former member for Parramatta, I remember having a conversation with her on this exact issue and saying that because her community was so full of people of faith, all different faiths, that there was a bit of, Labor was a bit on the nose after, the sort of second or third iteration of this religious discrimination vote. And I remember that Albanese, during the election campaign, made a big point of the fact that he was educated in the Catholic system, and he went to a Catholic school with, I think it was the Archbishop of Sydney, and made a real show of that. And I think that was his way of saying Labor is on board with, people of faith, Catholic values, so forth. Tass, just quickly, before we wrap this up, what are we likely to see sort of happen next in this debate?
So we've got the Australian Law Reform Commission's report now, which is its independent advice to government about what it should do on Section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act, and this question of LGBTQ kids and religious schools and also staff. So now that that's out there, that will place a real onus on the government to follow the recommendations to protect people. And I think we can expect, if the government doesn't show that it's willing to move in this space and move to protect children and staff, that there will be a really strong backlash from equality campaigners and from the LGBTQ community who point out they are still being discriminated against. And I think we can really expect those groups to kick up. And I don't know, the Greens are big on this issue. They've got a big cohort of young voters. Young voters are really passionate about LGBTQ issues.
So in the longer term, we can see it playing out, because we can't tell yet whether the Labor retreat on this issue is going to antagonise Green supporters and other voters in some of those what might be called Labor seats that are very vulnerable to the Greens. Will it play out on the ground in that way? And will some voters say, oh look, Labor's not standing up for me on this issue, I will move to the Greens on this issue in some of those city seats? We don't know how that'll play out yet.
Including Albanese's own seat of Green, which is constantly under attack from the Greens. Tass, thank you so much for your insights on this, and we'll keep reading your stories because we know you're all over it.
Thank you.
Okay, David, I want to quickly segue to foreign policy. First of all, this week, Foreign Minister Penny Wong hosted a visit from the Chinese Foreign Minister. How did that go?
Pretty smoothly, although very, very controlled. It has been a big week on foreign policy because the British ministers were here as well. But with the Chinese meeting, it was the Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Did not say much during his visit to Canberra. Very controlled, did not appear at a press conference where he had to take questions. So most of the speaking was done by Penny Wong. We know that she raised issues of concern, including what's happening in global commodities, because Australian exporters are really suffering from some of the Chinese agenda on driving down the price of things like nickel. Key issues also the Chinese message to us about AUKUS. It's very concerned about AUKUS, but we're standing by that policy. And also a key issue being Australian interests in the Pacific. So that went relatively smoothly insofar as you could expect it to when there are so many differences between the two countries on so many issues. It is worth noting, though, that although, of course, the Chinese are within their rights to have a meeting between their foreign minister and our former Prime Minister, Paul Keating. It was a notable meeting in the sense that there's so clearly the tension between Penny Wong and Paul Keating. And so Wang Yi made a point of going to visit Paul Keating in Sydney, somebody who's been so personally critical of Penny Wong.
Yeah, a little bit of a passive-aggressive bilat between Keating and the Chinese Foreign Minister. Now, speaking of former Labor Prime Ministers, we couldn't not mention the fact that Donald Trump has given an interview, of course, to British TV and made criticisms of our ambassador to the United States, Kevin from Queensland. What did you make of those criticisms and the opposition response to them in particular? Do you think it's a big deal, or is this just business as usual? This is what Trump does, Trump being Trump.
I think it's a big blow-up, no doubt about it. I think it also is who Trump is, why Trump behaves that way. It was, in a sense, a setup because this was a question from Nigel Farage, of all people, somebody who I don't think has huge credibility on global affairs, asking a question of Donald Trump in a Sky News or Sky Run channel about Kevin Rudd, leading question, encouraging an attack on Kevin Rudd. Job done, mission accomplished, and that's what happened. But Trump is a volatile character. He rants at people, he criticises people. We saw the release, not so long ago, of his transcript with his conversation with Malcolm Turnbull as Australian Prime Minister, just denouncing Turnbull, full of rage against him over an asylum seeker deal. And that's the way Trump behaves as president, now as a presidential candidate. And I think that highlights it's going to be a wild ride all this year in dealing with the things that Donald Trump will say. I mean, we can't assume that he's going to be happy with the AUKUS agreement, for instance. At some point, he's probably likely to fulminate against that because he'll want us to pay all the cost and the Americans to get money for it.
Isn't that kind of the point? I mean, it's extraordinary. It was an extraordinary comment in its ordinariness, in the sense that we're so used to this from Donald Trump now. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be alarmed by it, don't you think? I mean, and particularly given that, okay, Turnbull had a confrontation with Trump when they were both in office, which was over a relatively minor issue that was kind of no skin off Donald Trump's nose to take these asylum seekers, right? But AUKUS is a different kettle of fish. AUKUS is how many hundreds of billions of dollars are we dropping on that on both sides? We need major American buy-in, not just from the president, but from Congress. And it's a decades-long project.
Yeah, and I think that's why I kind of, part of me shrugs my shoulders at Trump mouthing off, because that is the way he operates. I worry more about what he does, whether he caves to Russian President Vladimir Putin over security in Europe, whether he caves to China on security in Asia, whether he reveals confidential US military secrets to people he shouldn't disclose that to. I worry about the things that he does much more than the things that he says in interviews, because he can contradict himself so often.
And it seemed to me, actually, he didn't really know who Nigel Farage was talking about particularly, but just arced up when he heard that Kevin Rudd had been critical of him.
Sorry, one of the things that you asked about was, well, how did the coalition respond? And that's kind of informative because of the domestic debate here. And the outcome is that the government locks in behind Kevin Rudd. Anthony Albanese cements him in that position, won't be moving him out of his position as ambassador in the United States because Donald Trump doesn't like him. But we also saw the coalition try to make mileage out of that in Parliament. And that was quite interesting, because in the past the coalition has not made politics out of Kevin Rudd. In some remarks has supported him there, and now is trying to chip away at Anthony Albanese for appointing Rudd in the first place. And that drew an interesting response from Anthony Albanese, because in the context of Peter Dutton claiming that this religious discrimination issue, which was a test of Anthony Albanese's character, the response from Albanese was to say that merely asking about this Donald Trump interview showed that Peter Dutton should not be Prime Minister. He tried to turn it back on the opposition leader. So it's getting much more willing between those two.
Yeah, and people are trying to characterise each other's characters. David, all fascinating. We will see you again next week. Thanks so much.
Cheers, Jackie.